Welcome back to Goldmark TV. A couple of interesting things to show you today. Later my colleague Kate is going to look at a really lovely Bruce McLean poster. And then we're going to take a look at a couple of Nic Collins bottles ahead of his new pots for a new exhibition we'll be holding in July. So stay tuned for that. First, something slightly different. A lot of the artists that we feature here at Goldmark are primarily artist printmakers, painter printmakers of the last 100 years. They're often British or European, but occasionally we like to dabble into works of art that are a little older, with a little more history to them, things that are particularly special. So today, we're going to be having a look at the history of Daumier and his Robert Macare suite. I hope you really enjoy seeing these images. In the summer of 1832, Honoré Daumier was sent to prison for 6 months for offending the king and his officers in a particularly acute satirical cartoon. He was sent to Sainte-Pélagie, it's a prison known for a place where the Parliamentary Assembly liked to send persona non grata insurrectionists, members of the revolution. And from his cell, it is said that Daumier could look out across through the bars and catch sight of the zoo at the Jardin des Plantes, where tigers and lions were prowling about in their cages. It's a lovely little image, that symmetry of Daumier looking at the beasts in their cages in the far distance while he's caged up himself. But it also was in some ways prophetic, because it was the human zoo of Paris which Daumier honed his eye on, and which, when the Parliamentary Assembly outlawed criticism of the king and of Parliament, to which he would return the spectrum of human indecency in his wonderful Robert Macare suite, which we're going to have a look at in just a minute. Though he was born in an old house off the port of Marseille, Daumier grew up in the streets of Paris, the same streets in which the Robert Macare suite is set. His father, Jean-Baptiste, was a simple glazier who harboured aspirations of becoming a poet, so when Daumier was just 8 years old, he moved the family to the capital. As a young boy, he would have been witness to some of the civil and social unrest in France at the time. He would have seen the climactic fall from grace of Napoleon, and then the subsequent restoration of the monarchy. And as a young artist, sketching in the streets, developing an interest in drawing and human behaviour, he would have been seeing some of the sights of social foment, of unrest in the city. As a young boy, Daumier took to art quite quickly. He would sketch in the streets, making caricatures of people walking around. But when he professed his desire to become an artist to his parents, they balked at the idea. They tried to pass him off to a number of different industries. So at one point he worked in a bailiff's office, but eventually they relented. By 1829, when he was just 21 years old, he was working in a lithography firm. And the chief there said, "You have the touch, you have what it takes to become a printmaker." Then came revolution. The current king, Charles X, was aging and ineffectual, and he'd allowed his subjects to come up with a new set of laws that were particularly censorious of the press. Sensing that the public opinion was on their side, a lot of the publishers hit back, and within a couple of weeks, the barricades were erected in the streets, and people were rioting. Charles was too slow to appease them, and he ended up having to flee the country to England. And in the power vacuum that emerged, Louis Philippe, one of his relatives, was quickly ushered back from exile by a number of opportunistic crown agents. Now, if this seems like a lot of setup, it's because the arrival of Louis Philippe and his reign really sets the social context, the social and financial context for the Robert Macare series. Louis Philippe promised progressiveness, he promised liberalism, but it was not forthcoming. And the monarchists and the loyalists and the revolutionaries, who were all sworn enemies for a time, were suddenly reunited in distaste for this new regime. He would hoard public funds. He continued the laws, these fairly draconic laws that imposed themselves on the press, on publishing. And it was not long before the backlash came from a number of satirical journals. Daumier was now working as a political cartoonist, and he made his own definitive statement on the new regime and its apathy towards its citizens. This was a print called Gargantua. It's arguably Daumier's most famous print, and it shows Louis-Philippe as a giant, eponymous French giant of myth, a Gargantua. His head like a great big pear, a large ramp up to his mouth as the citizens of Paris carry bags of gold to deposit in his mouth. He's sitting on a chaise percée, a kind of portable toilet, and below the bowl of the seat, a number of parliamentary officials are gaggling in their attempts to catch the excreta that are dropping from below. It was a searingly critical send-up of the state's financial excesses and Louis-Philippe's inability to rein them in. And it had been intended for publication in La Caricature. This was a new journal by Charles Philippon. He was a fantastic editor, a founder of a number of journals who really took to the vanguard of criticism against the king and his parliamentary assembly. Daumier was one of his star pupils, and a number of very popular, very talented and accomplished young caricaturists who he took under his wing and allowed them to develop their work in his journals. Unfortunately, the plate for Gargantua, the lithographic plate, was seized by the officials. Philippon and Daumier were fined, and Daumier was sent to prison at just 24 years old. During Daumier's time in prison, Philippon took to establishing a new journal. This was Le Charivari, which translates roughly to uproar or cacophony. It's a fantastic pun on the word, this sort of onomatopoeic sound, which captured the sense of revolution, of rebellion that Philippon came to symbolize with Daumier. For 3 years, they jabbed relentlessly at the king, and they weathered fines, they weathered seizures of prints, of lockdowns of the print workshops and the facilities, the confiscation of plates and a number of the editions, until eventually a series of very bloody uprisings that were brutally quashed by troops in Lyon and Paris that saw an end to it. An assassination attempt on the king's life in 1834, which failed, really brought a decisive end to any sort of clemency that had been shown before. And in September 1835, a new law was passed that said that any print, any image that was to be published had to be approved by the Interior Minister. For a satirical journal like Charivari that made its bread and butter on criticism, on opinion, on judgment of the state, for a time, freedom in the press in France was dead. While La Caricature, Philippon's famous journal, could not survive in this new climate, Charivari would. Philippon famously said, "They killed off a journal that came out weekly, so I brought in one that came out daily." Though Daumier could no longer attack the king and the parliament directly, they could expose the civil and industrial climate which it had created and came to represent. So while social injustice and poverty were widespread during Louis-Philippe's reign, business thrived and flourished. There was basically no regulation of businesses. And within this sort of dog-eat-dog economy, the rises of factories, of docks, of industrial production, of banks and finance, everything fed off this new world of intense rivalry and sort of unfettered greed. Daumier proposed to take on this sort of rapacity, the greed of this new age, in a series of human types, of human zoology, which he called the French types. And it's in that series of caricatures that the seeds of the Robert Macare series were first sown. So what I've got in front of me are original lithographs by Daumier from the Robert Macare series, and these have been beautifully hand-coloured. And if you might be able to see there's a slight sort of sheen to areas of them. They've also been touched up with gum arabic, which gives them this lovely shine. Macare and his sidekick Bertrand became a sort of a very famous comic duo, and these cartoons would have been produced in Charivari, but also published separately on these sort of thicker woven paper. So you see here, we've got a number of the original cartoons that have been bound here and laid down in black and white. That's a nice one. But these have been hand-coloured during, at the time of publication, as was quite normal for black and white prints of this kind. You can see in these next two prints that kind of world of industry that Daumier was exploiting and exposing. So here you've got Macare and his sidekick Bertrand. They're starting up a new asphalt company, but in fact the asphalt's just made up of manure and pebbles. Here's a prospective investor. And this is one of my favourites in the series. This is Macare turning up to his insurer. He's got two businesses, a super glue factory and a flintlock factory that somehow inexplicably seem to have both burnt down. And he says, nothing remains except my policy, and I've lost 100,300 francs and 51 centimes, which you'll of course pay me. What an absolute tragedy. And here you can see actually in this bit of the policy, it might, if you can just break it out, it says, do phoenix here, that idea of rising from the ashes. Macare and his emaciated sidekick Bertrand, who sort of populate this fantastic series, weren't actually made up by Daumier. The original character of Macare had been concocted by a trio of playwrights in 1823 for a sort of hammed-up, overcooked melodrama. On the first night of the premiere, the actor Frédéric Lemaitre, who was playing Macare, played him straight, as he was supposed to be in this play, and the performance bombed. So the next day, he decided with the rest of his cast that they would completely hem up the performance and turn it into a sort of a comic farce. And he turned his character, this sort of serious two-penny villain, into a sort of charming buffoon with this tramp's outfit. And it was an immediate success. The Macare character, the stereotype, became a sort of a classic and was used a lot in street performance and satire in Paris in the coming years. This is Macare the journalist, and this takes on another of Macare's more sort of scurrilous aspects. Here's his editor. He says, I've just written up this article on the new law that's been passed, and I've absolutely taken it to bits. And his editor says, no, Macare, we must be seen to be on the side of the law. And Macare says, oh, that's okay, then I'll just revise it and make sure that it's in favour of the aforementioned. I wonder if that reminds you of any politicians that we know at the moment. Daumier and Philippon took advantage of this sort of pre-existing character and all his ubiquitous tropes. And so they turned to this new series of caricatures, which was so successful that they ended up producing over 100 Macare images. Philippon would provide the text and Daumier the images, and between them they worked towards a sort of a real levity. Macare returned in a number of different roles as a lawyer, a profiteer, a publisher, a doctor, and in all of them he's sort of made out to be this fantastically grotesque and corrupt individual. Here he is, this is Macare the dentist, and this poor victim's complaining that he's pulled out the good teeth and left the bad, to which Daumier says, oh, don't worry, the good teeth were probably going to cause you some trouble later anyway, and now you can buy a pair of dentures. Daumier's Macare, like the original, is presented as utterly unscrupulous and totally without moral or ethics. Often these prints revolve around negotiations and the art of the deal. It's very sort of Trumpian, this world. Money, either disputedly owed or disreputably earned, is really at the centre of all of these images. Here's a lady who's come to Macare, applied for his assistance as a detective. She's lost 1,000 francs. And he tells her, don't worry, I'll be able to get it back for you. All I need is your fee for 1,500 francs and I'll make sure you get back your money. Adopting Macare as the symbol for Louis Philippe's reign was not just commercially shrewd and sensible of Philippon and Daumier, but it also played on a particular trick. Because Macare is notably not a member of the bourgeois class. He's very much a sort of a working class huckster, and his tricks are very much of that street dealer, that hustling vibe. But often the victims of his crimes are. What Daumier and Philippon were trying to say was there's an equality here, there's an equation between the dirty tricks that are being played out on the street and the behaviour of big business, of big industry and finance. Here, this is the fantastic Robert Macare, the discount broker. And you can see here he's got this big plump plain overcoat on and this scarf that's sort of hiked up around his mouth so that you can't see what he's saying. But actually, out of his back pocket, these beautiful sort of embroidered sheets are sort of unfurling. And he's offering this chap a series of brilliant deals. He says, if you give me 40,000 francs, then I can give you in return 25 francs in cash, 3,000 francs worth of mustard and articulated clogs, 3,000 francs worth of chips, a carriage wheel, 2 cows, 4 shares in physionotype. That was a kind of machine that takes casts of people's faces for sculptors to use. And a quintal of useful facts. I don't have any other assets in hand, but these are worth their weight in gold. If Gargantua and a number of the political prints that followed really set Daumier as the young rising star of caricature, it's the Robert Macare series that really cemented his reputation, for which he's best remembered. This is where his legacy really starts. And while I love the social context, I love the history behind these prints, I love the wit in them, the sort of the capturing of this sort of wonderful, incisive quality that Philippon and Daumier shared. It's really the draftsmanship that brings you back. They almost stand alone, free of their context. The sort of wonderful loose line that Daumier had, his ability to capture these beautiful expressions with just a few bits of pencil. They've got a wonderful sense of drama and theatre to them, which sort of harks back to the origins of Macare and Bertrand. But also a real sense of realism as well. This was a world which Daumier really saw. He saw evolving in front of him. He'd been to court, scenes like this. He'd worked in a bailiff's office as a young man. A lot of that distaste for bureaucracy, for officials, comes through. But really what's so enjoyable about them is just this wonderful line. And I think it's really beautifully lifted with this hand colouring, which has been really, really tastefully done. These beautiful washes of colour that just sort of pick up that sense of line, that sense of form, that wonderful exaggeration that you get in satirical drawing. Daumier was the great caricaturist of the 19th century. He really set the tone for the next 50, 100 years of cartoon making. And while he was looking back to people like Goya, sort of fellow satirists of the 18th century, he really set the tone. It's an enduring legacy. I think he had his thumb on the pulse of what being a citizen of Paris, of 19th century Paris, was really about. This extraordinary time of tumult and of turbulence. And while these scenes often depict these sort of moneyed up members of the aristocracy being sort of lampooned in these wonderful scenes and being shown up by the self-made man Macare, really Daumier knew what it was like to be an everyday citizen of Paris, to be a working class person trying to scrape a living in this very difficult and chaotic and often violent time. And these prints really, that's the undercurrent in this series, is the injustices that a lot of those people were faced under sort of state suppression and repression. I thought we'd finish today with one of my favourite prints of the Macare series, and it's this one up here of Macare in the restaurant with his sidekick Bertrand, with this fantastically grotesque face here that rivals any of Goya's own. In this print, Philippon and Daumier, who had really been the sort of primary champions of freedom of press, of the right of journals and newspapers to criticise the regime. Although they had been those champions, they didn't lose sight of their sort of sense of self-importance, and they often, rather sort of tongue-in-cheek, like to make fun of themselves and their rivals, as well as this sort of the very real situation they were in. So in this scene, Macare stands up and he says, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I appear to have lost my wallet or forgot to bring some money, so I can't pay you." He says, "However, for the 6 francs and 25 centimes that I owe you, how about I can offer you maybe 10 shares in La Presse," which was a rival publication, "or perhaps my friend's hat." To which the waiter replies, I think I prefer the hat, please."
Today we're going to have a look at this particular print by the Scottish artist Bruce McLean. Bruce McLean studied at Glasgow School of Art and then he went on to study at St Martin's. As a printmaker, we know Bruce McLean's work as being very bold, bright and always with a sense of humour. This is a particularly interesting piece. It's called Jazz at the Bull. And Bruce McLean designed it, had it printed as a fundraiser for the venue at the Bull's Head. The Bull's Head pub in Barnes opened as a jazz venue in 1959 and it was managed by a guy called Albert Tolley. It became an important venue in the UK for visiting international jazz musicians during the 1960s. The Bull's original music room opened at the same time as Ronnie Scott's jazz club and became known as Suburban Ronnie Scott's. This screen print that Bruce McLean made, it was done as a fundraiser to keep the venue going. There were some printed on a thinner paper in an unnumbered edition, but then he did this very small edition of only 35, which are signed and numbered, just down there. And as I said, it was made to raise money for the venue. I've chosen this piece today because, well, I like it. I think we've got a number of Bruce McLean prints here at the gallery, but this one, I like the composition, the design of it. I like the sort of humour element to it as well. I just think it's a nice piece. It's got a nice story to it. You know, it was made as a fundraiser and for a good venue as well.
I've got here out in front of me a really fantastic selection of little bottles by Nic Collins. These are one of his almost a sort of signature form, and they're a wonderful tool in his sort of potting vocabulary, because as a smaller shape they can be fitted within his kiln packing into very sort of different spots between pots. They can sort of take advantage of the size and the path of the flame in the kiln. Kiln packing is a very important part of Nic's work as a wood firer, and a fairly hardcore wood firer at that too. Making sure he's using that space as sort of creatively, as artistically as possible is really important to him. So that's what a lot of these bottles are able to do. They're able to fill those little gaps that are needed. I think they're really lovely. What's nice to see sort of embellishing these surfaces, these quite small surfaces which show off sort of the huge spectrum of colours and textures that you can get in a wood firing with only a few little glazes. I love the surface textures of the scallop shells and things that are used to pack these. Often Nic will pack these on their side so that all of the wonderful detail that you get in a wood firing isn't lost at the base. So you'll see a lot of them that have these sort of scars from the shells on their side. I've even got one here that looks like it's been sandwiched on both sides. You've got what looks like the remains of a shell up here. And on this side, what I think is some fire clay or some wadding that's been used in a sort of disc to occlude this surface from the effects of the embers and the fire, which is why you've got this different effect here. In this next little clip, I think I'd like to show you, Nic's going to talk about a couple of these little bottles and why he likes to place them on their sides like that.
These little bottles are some of my favourite forms to be making. I really enjoy throwing these. It enables me to almost get lost in what I'm doing and using the clay as an expressive medium. They fit almost anywhere in the kiln very successfully, and I can utilise what's going on in the kiln. These little bottles have both been quite close to one another, and they've both been stacked using little bits of seashell on their side. This one has been under a side stoking hole, so it's been buried in embers, and then the embers have melted, producing the glaze. And as you can see, we get this lovely blue, greens, purples, and then this little speck of orange of the Chino glaze coming through really enlightens the whole pot. And on the other hand, this one has been positioned maybe about 12 inches from this one. So it hasn't had the embers on it, but still gathered a lot of wood ash. And so there's more orange on this pot. So you can build up a huge variation of the effects of the firing and where these pots are placed in the kiln. And they really carry the picture of the firing for me, because I can fit them into little places. This one's been stacked up against another pot, so it's been sheltered from the ash and the flames, so we can build up again another story. And then when you pick it up and there's this lovely dribble of ash where the ash is gathered, and this lovely orange around the pot. These bottles will fit in between other pots on their side or upright, depending on the space I have in the kiln. A very freely thrown form. Sometimes I prefer to see a round form made up of straight, angular lines. For me, it's a much more pleasant form to be making. And also all these lines will deflect the fire and catch things and miss things, i.e. wood ash and flame. It will make the fire dance around the pot. This particular bottle vase has been stacked again on seashells, 3 of them, in the kiln like so, and the fire has come and hit this side, and ash has been deposited and run round. So then when you lift up, you've got all this that would normally be on the underside of a pot is on the decoration side. And it's my decoration for the pot. It's been Chino glazed, totally immersed in Chino. And on the other side, rather than just having all the one side covered in wood ash, I've put on a pad of fire clay resist. So just a thin pad of clay has been placed over, and that's protected the pot, and no ash has been deposited there. So I can build up a colour, different colours by doing that. And most of the time, just tap that and the pad will fall off. Sometimes, of course, they don't, they stick. And so that's the risk that I take when stacking these in the kiln.
I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of these bottles here today and some of the other things that we showed earlier in our broadcast. I wanted to showcase Nic's work because later next month we're going to be hosting an exhibition of his pots, and those are set to arrive later this week, I think. So if you like what you've seen here today, if you're new to Nic's work, or if you're on the lookout for more of Nic's pots, do please email our pots team. They're at pots@goldmarkart.com. Let them know you're interested in the new work that will be arriving soon. And once we've got them unpacked and we've got some photographs to send to people, we'll let people know that the work's here and it's here to view. I'm really excited to see what Nic's been coming up with. I think it was 2017 was our last show of his work. So it's been a little while, and it'll be really interesting to see what pots have come out of that period since. So do stay tuned for that. I'm going to leave you with Nic now and a short clip from our film that we made back in, I think, 2011, that, if you've not seen it before, gives you a feeling for some of the philosophy behind his work, some of the thoughts that he has about wood firing and about firing in this sort of wonderful, creative but very risky way. I hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
I do a 4-day firing, and I make the pots to fit in various parts of the kiln, and I like to stack pots on the side. You know, most potters would stack a pot that way up, but with wood firing, then where the flame hits the wads that it sat on, that's where it makes all the interesting things. So if that was just stacked upright, you'd have a very boring pot. All the interesting things would be on the bottom. So that's why it's important for me to stack things on the side and against one another. And I do a lot with the fire, so I kind of, it's not just about getting it up to temperature. There's a lot of side stoking, so I surround pots with embers and I play around with the fire. Temperature doesn't really matter at this point. It's the last day that I go for the temperature rise. It's custom for us. We have a big fried breakfast on the last morning of the firing, you know, so for a moment the kiln gets stuffed full of wood and gives us all time to have a good feed, and then we get back to the firing. So it's all kind of, the social side of it is important to me too. It brings the best out of the people, I think, having a firing. And that's another thing with wood firing, I think. You have to be prepared to take those failures and be prepared to get on and do it again. You know, I think that's probably the drive for a wood firer, is that 9 times out of, well, most of the time it's not what you expect. So you get up and you do it again, you know, and you get it hopefully right next time. You know, a lot of people also say it's accidental, which makes me feel a little bit angry that these results were an accident, because they're not. You know, it's all very controlled. It's out of control, if that makes any sense. You know, you have an idea and you push for that, but always it comes out something unexpected. And always open up the kiln and it's very disappointing, and you have to go away, come back with a fresh mind and look at what you've got. And that's what fires up a wood fire. I think that's what keeps them going. A Japanese potter who was extremely influential for me, and that's a guy called Shiro Tsuchimura, who came to Devon and stayed with some friends of mine and worked for an exhibition in the Besson Gallery in London. Now this guy came over. He was not your usual Japanese potter. He was actually the son of a dairy farmer, and then went on to become a Buddhist monk, and then got into pots, looking at antique Japanese pots. But he approached it in the manner that a child would. He'd seen this pot and he'd made up in his mind, in his own head, how that had been made, and he'd do it. And this guy, he broke all the rules. And beautiful pots, absolutely stunning. But they had that soul in them, you know, they had that feeling, that kind of primeval, deep down, something that grabs you. But I went along, he fired this little kiln, fired with oil, and threw wood ash on the pots. And then I went, just as he was finishing the firing, and he was climbing up, and all he did was throw this wodge of clay on the big hole where the oil burner was, and there were holes everywhere. It was like, you know, like a cathedral with all the light shining out. And everything that I'd been taught told me those pots will all be dunted, they'll all be cracked, there'll be nothing left. And I went along the next day thinking they'd all be rubbish, and he opened up this kiln and pulled out this first pot. Man, my heart, oh, it was a stunner, real stunner. But that was a valuable lesson for me, you know. It taught me that rules are there to break. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but when you kind of take those risks, then you will get reward. What you do the last 2 minutes of this firing, that determines everything, I believe. You know, how you finish that kiln off, what you do. And a lot of things, there's no kind of written way to do it. It can change with what wood you're using, how the condition of the wood, i.e. is it green, is it bone dry, is it a little bit damp, weather conditions, you know, anything changes it, and you're constantly looking in the kiln, reading the fire, the speed of the flame, where the flame's hitting, and reduction, colour, temperature. There's millions and millions of things that you have to register. So of course, you know, you're going to get some things wrong. So I don't hardly ever sleep when I'm firing. You know, I quite often come out and shock the person who's out there about putting a bit of wood in the kiln, and I'm out there in my underpants just checking that everything's all right, because I'm laying in bed worried sick about it, but there's no need to. But I like, as I say, I think the end of the firing is perhaps the most important, to read what's happened and to be able to react. It's quite easy to give up too early and walk away, whereas another 5 minutes, you know, would have made a disastrous firing into a beautiful firing. So that's why I like to be as fresh as possible. In the past I have thrown pots up against the wall and in a fit of rage, but I've learnt that's the wrong thing to do. You know, you change your mind and you just have to live with something.
We need to educate, entertain our customers.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some other of his prints.
Thinking very seriously about stopping making pots.
But there's nothing forced. And I think his jogs are really the epitome of that.
Hello, welcome to today's broadcast from the Goldmark Gallery.
One of my most regular places to visit up in this part of the world is the Goldmark Gallery.